I was just hanging up my stethoscope, thinking about what to grab for dinner. The clock on the locker room wall started to melt, like wax dripping down a candle. I couldn't understand why the second hand was moving backward. Then, I realized I wasn't standing on the floor anymore. I was looking down at the gray hair on top of my own head. It was a Tuesday, just a regular, grueling Tuesday at the hospital. You know the kind, where the smell of industrial bleach and stale coffee seems to seep into your very pores. I've been an ER nurse for 15 years. I'm used to the chaos. I'm the guy people look to when things go sideways because I don and panic. I just do the job. But that afternoon, something felt off. I remember checking a patient's vitals around 4 p.m. and feeling this strange, dull throb in my left jaw. I brushed it off. I told myself it was just stress, or maybe I'd been clenching my teeth too hard during the shift. We'd had 3 traumas back to back, and I hadn't sat down in hours. I kept going. That's what we do, right? We excuse the little signs because they're always someone else in more pain. I remember walking toward the break room to grab my jacket. The fluorescent lights overhead felt aggressive, sharper than usual. Each hum of the vending machine sounded like a low-frequency scream. I reached for my locker handle. It was cold, real cold, and I noticed my fingernails looked a bit blue. End quote. Hey John, you okay? You look like you and VE seen a ghost, end quote. Sarah, one of the night shift nurses, asked as she passed by. I opened my mouth to tell her I was fine. I was going to say, end quote, just tired, Sarah? See you tomorrow, end quote. But the words didn't come out. Instead, I felt this heavy, wet sensation in my chest, like someone had poured hot lead into my lungs. It wasn't even a sharp pain, really. It was just an overwhelming weight. I remember looking at a small coffee stain on my white sneaker. I thought, I need to bleach that tonight. And then the room started to tilt. Not like I was falling, but like the building itself was being flipped upside down. The locker room door, the one with the chipped blue paint I'd looked at 1,000 times, started to stretch. It became miles long. I tried to reach out to steady myself, but my hand, it just passed right through the metal. That was the first wrong thing. I felt this strange, localized silence. The hospital is never quiet, never. But suddenly, the sound of the monitors, the distant sirens, the paging system, it all just evaporated. I was standing there, but I wasn't I was hovering. I looked down and saw a man slumped against locker 42. He looked tired. He looked gray. It took me a heartbeat too long to realize he was wearing my name tag. Everything went heavy. Then, everything went nothing. It's hard to describe the transition from being a body to just being a point of view, end quote. There wasn't a sudden flash or a dramatic bang. It was more like a candle being blown out in a drafty room. 1 second, I was struggling to breathe, the air feeling like thick, jagged glass in my throat. And the next, the struggle just stopped. The pain, that lead-heavy weight in my chest, it didn't just fade. It vanished. Along with it went the itch in my eyes from the 12-hour shift, the ache in my lower back, even the feeling of my clothes against my skin. I was suspended. I remember the silence most of all. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a vacuum. Deep. Absolute. I tried to gasp, to feel that panicked reflex of a dying man, but there was no to gasp. I was just a consciousness floating in a thick, velvety ink. I thought, oh, this is it. I expected to be terrified. I'm a nurse. I've seen people fight death with every ounce of their strength. But in that darkness, I felt this strange, unsettling indifference. I wasn't Jonathan anymore. I was just an observer. Time didn't just slowed down. It stopped being a line. I felt like I was stuck in the gap between 2 heartbeats. And then, the darkness didn't break, but it changed. It started to vibrate. I couldn't hear it with ears, but I could feel it in whatever I had become. It was a low, humming frequency that felt like truth. I remember thinking about my keys. They were in my pocket, but I didn't have a pocket. I looked up, if that word even means anything there, and I saw a tiny, flickering spark. It wasn't a light at the end of a tunnel. It was more like a hole poked in a dark piece of paper, and something incredibly bright was trying to bleed through from the other side. I felt a pull, not a physical tug, but a magnetic one, like I was a stray thought being pulled back into a massive, dreaming mind. I remember saying, or thinking, wait, not yet. But the dark didn't end Apos. Care what I wanted. I was hovering near the ceiling, right next to the vent that always rattles. I could see the dust settled on top of the lockers. It's funny the things you notice when you're technically dead. I saw Sarah screaming for help. I saw Dr. Miller run in. He was wearing one blue sock and one black sock. He must have dressed in a hurry that morning. I watched them drop to their knees beside me. It was like watching a movie of someone else's life. I saw Miller start the compressions. I could hear the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of my own ribs cracking under his palms. As a nurse, I know that sound. It's the sound of saving a life. But from up there, it just sounded like someone breaking dry sticks. I wanted to tell them to stop, not because I wanted to die, but because they looked so frantic, so small. I saw myself from an angle I've never seen in a mirror. I looked old. I looked like a man who had spent 40 years carrying things that Warren and Apos has to carry. Then, I noticed something that Shuden and Apos have been possible. I could hear their thoughts, not like voices in a radio, but like ripples in water. I could feel Miller's ego. He didn't and Apos want to lose a staff member on his watch. It wasn't Apos just about me. It was about his record. I felt Sarah's genuine terror. She was thinking about my wife, Martha, and how she'd have to be the one to call her. And then, I started to drift. The locker room walls didn't and Apos disappear. They just became transparent, like layers of gauze. I could see into the next room, then the next. I saw a woman in room 302 crying over a sandwich. I saw a janitor smoking in the loading dock. The physical world was becoming thin, brittle. I felt this sudden, sharp realization. Everything I thought was solid is just a shadow. I looked back at my body one last time. It looked like a discarded suit. A heavy, worn-out costume that I didn't and Apos want to put back on. I turned away from the light of the ER and let the pull take me. I wasn't in Apos in the hospital anymore. I was in a place that felt like a vast, echoing cathedral made of nothing but silver fog. There was no floor, yet I felt grounded. There was no sun, yet everything was illuminated by a light that seemed to come from inside the objects themselves. And then the voices started. They weren't and Apos, ghosts or angels, They were just ripples of sound. But as they got closer, they crystallized into sentences. My sentences, I'm just staying late to help with the charts, I heard my own voice say. I remembered saying that to Martha 3 years ago, but in this place, I didn't and Apos just hear the words. I felt the vibration of the lie. I hadn't and Apos been helping with charts. I'd been hiding in the break room because I couldn't and Apos faced the heaviness of our home after the miscarriage. Another voice drifted by, it's out of our hands. You did everything you could, I heard myself telling a grieving mother. But in the silver fog, the truth stripped the skin off the memory. I knew, in that moment, I'd said it because I wanted to go home and eat dinner, not because I actually believed we'd done enough. It was a life review, I guess people call it. But it wasn't an Apos a highlight reel. It was a ledger of every time I had chosen comfort over the truth. Every little lie I'd told to keep the peace, to protect my ego, or to avoid a difficult conversation. I felt a presence beside me. I couldn't and Apos see a face, but it felt like a mountain, ancient, unmovable, and terrifyingly kind. It didn't and Apos judge me. It didn't and Apos have to. Being in that light was like standing naked in front of a mirror that showed your soul instead of your skin. I saw how every white lie had created a tiny fracture in the people I loved. I saw how my calm persona at the hospital was often just a mask I used to keep from actually feeling empathy for the dying. I felt a wave of crushing regret, not for the big sins, but for the missed opportunities to be authentic. I heard every lie I had excused, I thought, and the weight of it was more painful than the cardiac arrest. The presence didn't and Apos speak in words, but I understood the message. You built a house out of shadows. Go back and build one out of light. I wanted to stay and apologize to the fog, to the light, to everyone. But the end quote, pull end quote, became a shove. The return was violent. It was Nandapos, a gentle drifting back into my skin. It felt like being slammed into a cold, wet suit of armor that was 3 sizes too small. Gasp. The first thing I felt was the searing, localized fire in my chest where the paddles had hit me. Then, the taste of copper in my mouth. End quote. We got him. He's back. John, stay with me. End quote. It was Miller's voice, but it sounded different now. I didn't Nandapos, just hear his words. I could still feel that lingering residue of his ego, his relief that his end quote, streak end quote, was Nandapos, broken. It made me want to vomit. I spent 3 weeks in the ICU. The doctors talked about end quote, oxygen deprivation end quote, and end quote, hallucinations brought on by cerebral hypoxia, end quote. They had labels for everything. They used clinical words to try and bury what I had seen under a mountain of Latin terms. But they weren't Nandapos, there. They didn't Nandapos, hear the echoes in the silver fog. It's been 5 years now. I'm still a nurse, but I'm not the end quote, common quote, one anymore. Not in the way I used to be. I don Nandapos, hide behind the mask. If a patient is dying, I sit with them. I don Nandapos, tell them end quote, it's going to be okay end quote, if it's not. I've learned that a hard truth is a much better companion than a comfortable lie. Martha and I, we're different too. I told her everything. About the miscarriage, about the nights I hid in the break room, about the fear I'd spent decades burying. It nearly broke us. But for the first time in 20 years, when I look at her, I'm actually there. I still have dreams about that locker room. Sometimes, I'll be washing my hands, and I'll look at my reflection in the sterile hospital mirror. I look for that spark, the hole in the paper. I know it's still there, waiting. People ask me if I'm afraid of dying now. I tell them no. I'm not afraid of the end. I'm just terrified of living another day where I'm not being honest about the middle. I still have that pair of sneakers. The ones with the bleach stain on the toe. I can't bring myself to throw them away. They remind me that I died for a few minutes, and I finally started hearing the truth.